Okay, hello everyone. Shall we get started? My name is Taylor. I'm from the University of Bonn, and I will be moderating this session and the final breakout session of the conference. Before we get started and introduce our first speaker, I just want to say one quick thing. We're going to do a little bit of an iteration, if I understand correctly, from our presenters today. So this is sort of, our three presenters are all part of the same project, and they applied with a more sort of cohesive session. So we're going to try and stick more or less to the 30-30-30, so people moving in between rooms can still join for talks. But depending on time we have at the end, we also are hoping to open it up for more general discussion about the themes discussed throughout all three of the talks, depending on, of course, how much time we have. So if you have some ideas brewing, you don't get to ask it for the first two presenters, keep it with you because we might have a chance to discuss at the end. But now I will give the floor to our first speaker, Tomasz Hollanek from the University of Cambridge. The floor is yours.
Yes, thanks so much, Taylor, and thank you, Aimee, and the rest of the team for organizing this conference. We're the last panel on the last day, so we will try to make it a little entertaining. I included one joke in the presentation, and Carrie has beautiful illustrations, so we'll see how it goes. So our panel is focusing on more than human-centered approaches to AI, and that to some of you will sound very familiar, to some of you it might sound very vague. My presentation on strategies for more than human-centered AI design. So as you can see, I highlight here the word strategy and design to make it clear that I'm kind of interested in practical applications of these theories. What I ended up with, though, is more of a theory for translating theory into practice, but we'll see. So translating theory, principles, frameworks into practice is obviously a very common theme in AI ethics discussions. And for that reason, the OECD, the OECD's catalog of tools for trustworthy AI includes now almost 500 different kinds of tools. They focus on different aspects of the development process. They can be technical, aiming at developers. They can be procedural, as you can see here. That's the typology that the OECD use for that catalog. They can be more educational, so introducing developers to issues such as inclusivity. Anyway, the point really is that there are so many of these toolkits. And because there are so many toolkits, there are also so many papers that analyze the toolkits. So these are just some examples of scoping papers on various tools, toolkits, guidelines. And for this presentation, I thought I would distill some of the emerging trends from the scoping papers on. So it's you know, sort of like a meta analysis of AI toolkits. If you feel like some of the points that I will mention now sound very familiar, that's exactly the point. We keep hearing the same things repeated over and over, so I'll just quickly go over them. Most of these meta critiques of toolkits mention the fact that the concerns of minoritized stakeholders are not given enough or any attention, even when the rhetoric of participation is evoked in some way. There are no real guidelines on how this kind of participatory work could be done in practice. So that's one point of critique that is common in most of these papers. The other one is that the understanding of ethics that these toolkits embody is very limited, either evocative of corporate accountability ideas, or simply that even if the question of ethical moral reasoning is mentioned, it's very much limited to the Western conception of ethics. There isn't enough said about ethics of care, relational ethics, or non-Western ethics in general. So that's, again, a common point among all these scoping papers. Then, again, something common is the implied techno-solutionism that the toolkits represent. So the idea that by just changing a procedure or just introducing a technical measure, we can address these bigger systemic questions. And related to that, the fact that non-technical aspects of technology development is not given enough attention. And again, there isn't, even if it's mentioned, it's not really explained how this kind of integration of non-technical work could be done through the use of toolkits. Business decision making is also not given enough scrutiny. So even when the toolkits suggest some strategies for how to change the design process, it really focuses on design and development, not so much on higher level thinking that obviously the end product is the result of. And finally, and most importantly for us today, some values are simply missing. So even if various theories are evoked, what is common is that environmental sustainability is barely ever mentioned. If actually, I think very, very few of the toolkits that the OECD's catalog includes mention environmental sustainability. Okay, so now my actual presentation is on a more than human approach to technology design and whether perhaps thinking about this approach might help us address some of these issues that were raised by the meta critiques. And the second meta question is whether the challenge of reorienting practice towards just and sustainable outcomes is actually kitifiable. Is the toolkit the right kind of tool at all? So first, very briefly, what is more than human-centered design? At its most fundamental level, more than human-centered design is a critique of human-centered design. So critical design scholars and practitioners criticize the human-centered paradigm for two reasons, and they were mentioned throughout various presentations in the past 3 days. So the first one is that the idea of the human that the human-centered framework evokes is a very particular kind of human, even though it might sound like even if human-centered design might sound like something that, because it places the user needs at the forefront of the design process, it should include more people. It actually fails to do that, has failed to do that. And so, so that's something that I think Carrie will be saying more about in her presentation later today. The second point of critique is related to the implied anthropocentrism of the human-centered framework. Quite obviously, even if we learn to include all the humans out there, even if we move from the idea of human-centered design to humanity-centered design, still it will be an anthropocentric framework. And the anthropocentrism, the anthropocentric logic that we have in mind here is at the root of the environmental crisis. So without tackling that, can we really move on? So this framework, more than human-centered design, draws on intersectional feminist critique, post-human theory, post-development studies, indigenous epistemologies, and various other critical alternative might not be the best word, but let's say alternative approaches. And Carrie and Apolline will be discussing these theoretical approaches more in their presentations. I should also mention, and this is something maybe we will have time to discuss, Taylor raised this question of whether more than human is the right term for what we're doing, really. You could also say nature-centric. I prefer to use the term allocentric. This is a short description from an article that I published 2 years ago, but I will skip it because it's not really important. Allocentric is the opposite of egocentric, essentially. And so it signals the conceptual decentering of the human in design, but rejects an environmentalism in which technology is solely about stopping human decline. And I thought I would give you some tangible examples of what this kind of design might actually look like by showcasing 3 different types of ideation tools for more than human-centered design. The first one is a guideline on design for carbon-aware digital experiences by Louis, who essentially, these are just instructions for designers. For example, when you're thinking about a product, you could provide information on carbon intensity to the user. You could help the user schedule according to carbon intensity forecasts, etc. There are a few other points that Louis is making. So this tool is really about transforming. So this is a guideline on how the designer might help the user transform their behavior so that it's more attuned to more than human rhythms. So this is the example that that this specific designer gives of this framework, how it could be used. This is a speculative design, obviously. So nature-controlled internet would work in a way that, so basically if there is, if your area is windy or sunny, your internet will speed up. But if there is not enough sun or if it's not windy, so renewable resources are not available in your area, the internet will slow down. Second example of a more than human design tool is the interspecies design toolkit by a critical design studio in the UK. I'm not sure if this looks familiar to you, but it's a very clear reference to this very popular inclusive design toolkit by Microsoft. So it's both a visual reference, but also a theoretical reference, because inclusive design is really about focuses on highlighting the types of users that mainstream designers don't consider in their work. But this critical interspecies design toolkit points to the fact that maybe it's not only about including more types of people, but also thinking about animals and so non-human animals, so more than human others, transforming the notion of the user itself, thinking about what it might mean for the designer to think about the user that is more than human. And this slightly vague tool, this compass, is another reference to a very well-known design ideation tool or expression of a design philosophy, the Bauhaus wheel, if you're familiar with it, by Walter Gropius. So this is Neri Oxman's, what I would call compass. She calls it the Krebs cycle of creativity, but we can skip that. Neri Oxman's practice is supposed to be nature-centric, mediating between human needs, environmental constraints, and the well-being of other entities with which we share the planet. But the most important element of her work that I find relevant for us at this conference is the question that she foregrounds in her work, which is bringing the digital creation closer to material production. And to make this point a little more tangible, I will quickly show you this project that is probably the most famous project by Neri Oxman and her team at the MIT Media Lab, the Silk Pavilion. So essentially what Neri Oxman and her team did, they used machine learning algorithms to analyze behavioral patterns of living silkworms so that they could build something with the silkworms. So this is a silk construction without killing a single silkworm. So the machine learning algorithm enabled them to predict the silkworm's patterns, and by manipulating temperature and light, they were able to direct biological growth to achieve this result. Again, this is a speculative project, not something that you could easily turn into an industry application, but it points to another layer of transformation, which is, so we discussed the transformation of user behaviors, the user's behaviors, then I showed you how we might want to think about transforming the idea of the user itself, and now this project also points to the idea of transforming our understanding of the designer as well, thinking about other creatures with which we share the planet as not only entities with which we co-experience the world, but also potentially co-design. Now, there are many other alternative toolkits. None of these you will find in the OECD catalog. Intersectional design cards, inclusion, not just an add-on guideline, and various others, intersectional AI toolkit, the Oracle for Transfeminist Technologies deck card. But for the purpose of this presentation, I tried to distill some of the essential features of this toolkit these toolkits and what makes them different from the ones that I discussed at the beginning. And so the first point is that these toolkits address the question of decentering the human as an explicitly ethical political issue. So something that needs a systemic fix, not something that can be fixed by minor changes to the technology used or procedures implemented. The second is that they specifically address the ideation stage of design, including the business decision-making that goes into any product. And this type of toolkit looks nothing like IBM's checklist for sustainability. So this type of exercise, I think Larissa and Aimee published a paper on sustainability and the checklist ethics as a problem. So that's a reference to that in part. But what they remind me of is the types of toolkits that political movements use to advance their agenda. And that's, so some examples of toolkits, and the joke is coming up. So this toolkit for intersectional movement building, just an example of the kind of toolkit that the design toolkits I just mentioned remind me of. Cool, perfect. Why is intersectionality relevant to climate justice? So just an explanation, followed by some specific exercises, identity mapping exercises, and some other, and so this is the joke. So the type of toolkit that I have in mind now reminds me of this gay toolkit that Bolsonaro mentioned in his political campaigns. He has been referring to the same toolkit for the past 10 years. Thankfully, he failed. No one was actually scared enough of the gay toolkit. But he's pointing to something interesting here, and what I mean here is the potential of a toolkit to actually advance a change. So coming back to my questions, how can a more than human-centered approach to technology design help us address the concerns raised by the meta-critiques of responsible AI toolkits? And is the challenge of reorienting practice towards just and sustainable outcomes actually quantifiable? It isn't quantifiable, but it can help us address these two dimensions of the problem. So yes, we can think of new design standards and help educate designers by the production of new toolkits and ideation exercise, and this is what I also do in my work. So through this ideation exercise as an example, I will not go into detail for now, but also thinking about this other element, political movement building. I added this slide after hearing Cesar's presentation lecture on the first day about pluriversal ethics. There are already design tools that specifically address the question of how to operationalize pluriversal approaches to design, such as this one. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to look it up. Pluriverse.world website. Essentially, what these tools help us understand is how some of the ideas that we as designers or we as academics know very well could be translated into a language that is more easily understandable to populations that don't have the kind of education to formulate their own ideas for design, their own ideas for the future. And so, to conclude, the act of toolkitting can help with educating some designers, drawing on a format that is very well known to designers, and provide others with a useful vocabulary and a framework for articulating their own design concerns, ideas, fantasies. And I will stop here to allow some time for questions, but also so that we can have more presentations on the theory. Thank you.
Thank you, Tomasz, for this first very interesting presentation. I really want you to send me this paper about the allocentric design. But okay, questions from the audience, and I'll also remind those of us joining online to please use the Q&A function, which I will check and pass along the questions. But any questions for the humans in the room? I think we have one and two. Yeah. So I think Luke and then or Aimee then.
Yeah, we can just go ahead.
This was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I had one question about the move away from human-centric design. And I completely agree with the critiques of the universalism and the anthropocentrism, but I wonder if you've thought much about what you might be giving up when you move away from this rhetoric that is so ingrained and so popular, and so much has been done under this label of human-centric design, which I think is largely also positive. So have you thought about perhaps you are alienating a part of this that might also be good, and how can you perhaps keep the good stuff and leave the bad stuff behind?
Thanks so much for this question. Okay, so I have a two-layered response. The first one is that when you look at the history of the human-centered design framework, you realize that it was never meant to solve the issues that we are trying to address here. So, for example, it was never meant to prioritize users' well-being over company goals, so profits. So that was when you actually look at the original text by Norman, for example, you see that the business incentives are, so literally what he says in that book on human-centered design from the 80s is that good design always sells. So the human-centered framework as a framework is always linked to the ideas of capitalism that we have been criticizing in this during this conference. But the second one, the second layer to my response, to your question, is that maybe we shouldn't be focusing. So this is why I try to sort of stress the idea of movements rather than. So this might not be about teaching designers that are already designing in a specific way to design differently, but it might be equally important, if not more important, to empower different kinds of people to design in different ways, come up with their own proposals, counter proposals that don't have to translate into products that sell. So it's about, but at the same time, empowering them to use a language that potentially could translate into products. Not sure if this is a satisfactory answer, but
It's a good answer, and I will think about it more.
Thanks, Tom, for the fantastic presentation. I really enjoy the topic. I'm so glad that we have the afternoon for this session. I'm wondering, so I was just moderating the panel with Jan Kleijsen from the Council of Europe, so I've got governance on my brain, and I reject the checklist and the toolkits, and it's the simplification of these the difficult abstract concepts. But then what do you do when policy making comes into the space, or when companies have to synthesize it reduce it in a certain way? Then what is the solution if it's not a toolkit? And then I love your answer to the first question when you were saying maybe it's not about like teaching designers how to think differently because they already have a certain way of thinking, but about stimulating a new demographic or cohort to do design. Would you even go so far as to say that this is a must? Not like, this is what we should do, but this is a must. And again, I've got governance on the brain because of where I just came from. So maybe that's too harsh of a question, but yeah, what is the solution to no toolkits if they become essential for policymaking? And do you think that we should go stronger and say we must have people other than designers thinking about these things?
Thank you. So about policymaking, I think it really depends on what kind of change we're trying to introduce. So so in this case, thinking about more than human-centered approaches to design that I think are essential to changing the logic that underlies the current crisis, that's not something you can achieve by just introducing a new toolkit. So that's my point. But the toolkit could be useful, for example, And this is, as you know, because we're working on this bigger project together. So a toolkit might be very useful, for example, if you're trying to translate some of the policy language into a design language. So when you're thinking about when we're thinking about the AI Act in the EU that is very vague to an average designer, for example, the idea that we need to design in ways that do not undermine fundamental rights and values, such as human dignity. What does human dignity mean to a designer? And so this is something that a design toolkit can do effectively, even the kind of traditional toolkit. And the second part of your question?
Must. You said, you know, maybe we should be inspiring other cohorts besides the designers to think in this way. And I said, would you go so far as to say that we must do that?
Yeah, I think, yes, I think we do. But also, you know, this is this presentation changed slightly because of what we heard during the conference. And I think this is also an attempt at a call to you, to everyone, to researchers, to think about the toolkit as a tool, as a means to affecting communities that are disengaged, that are not part of the debate, and how we can translate some of the concept that we are exploring here in ways that are empowering those communities. Yeah.
Just a quick plug for the art science residency. I hope everyone has seen the artistic installations upstairs that are doing a little bit of what you're talking about.
Great. And I think we have time for one last question.
No pressure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tom, for the presentation, also for this answer just now. I think for the first time, I'm kind of convinced of the necessity for toolkits. And I'm also very, made very much sense to me to stop on political movement building. That kind of brought everything into focus, what those toolkits really can do. Now I'm thinking about toolkits as a narrative form, because I think in the end that is what it is, if you're talking about movement building. Did you do any research, or do you know of any research on the dissemination, on the outreach of those toolkits, and how that works, which kind of communities they address, and how well they maybe jump borders between different communities, if at all?
Okay. Thanks so much, Christiane. Very, very quickly. Okay, so the standard toolkits are produced by design teams, research teams, by companies themselves, and in the end, they reach no one. Actually, the research that I mentioned at the at the beginning shows that no one uses them. So there are like 500. There will be 1,000 by the end of the year. No one uses them. No designer actually. So the other toolkits are produced by specific movements to formulate their political idea for what design should be like. And I think there is something much more interesting happening in that second space. I'm not sure how that insight translates into what we are supposed to do as a team on a project, but this work translates into a paper on the ethical politics of design toolkits that I will try to finalize soonish. And I hope that that will be a good grounds for our team's work on a potential toolkit. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.